Paul Twomey, we hear a lot about the theft of the intellectual property by China and others, but what is being done about that?
Well, one of the problems about this whole space of intellectual property is that there's difficulties in the markets to value it. So insurers, you can't get insurance on intellectual property because they can't actually value IP. They'll give you insurance for all sorts of cyber, there's increasingly cyber policies available, but the intellectual property is very difficult. So as a consequence, what we've got is companies self-insuring. And we don't have very good transparency on that. And I think this is a real issue we're going to have to address. The Americans have moved to saying at the SEC level that you have, if you're a public listed company, you have to report breaches, which is not just what the states, they've got 39 states require you to report about publicly, about citizens' information, consumer information that's been stolen. And that's sort of one level of cyber crime. And we hear a lot about that, a billion passwords got stolen, that sort of news stories we hear, right? But that's all driven by that disclosure requirement. The other disclosure requirement is what's the impact been on your intellectual property? And is that you getting theft there? And at least in the United States, there is some cause to report that, and if you have to report that, then there's a chance for the markets to sort of begin to think about the implications of it. We don't have that in Australia. I think we really should be thinking much more beyond the short term, I don't want to be embarrassed question, to what is the systemic benefit of having more transparency into that, and what do people do in response? I think that's a really big issue.
Is much of it, is the theft of intellectual property at the corporate level as well as perhaps the music and books and all that stuff level increasing? It's
very high. Whether it's getting any worse this year than it was last year, it'd be hard for me to say. But it's certainly clear in our experience. We serve clients in North America, Europe, Middle East, other things, that the old phrase that if you haven't been penetrated it's because you're not looking hard enough is absolutely correct. And the degree to which intellectual property is being stolen by players is stunning. I mean, it just stuns me, the degree to that's taking place. And
what do you think, in fact, that IP loses its meaning?
Well, that becomes a really interesting issue, right? It certainly means, in some funny sense, and I don't think Australian companies, at least in my experience, I don't know how many of them actually get this yet. Again, maybe they're not forced to tell us, so they don't. We don't know. But the interesting challenge is that we've had since the 18th century this sort of contract which says, I, as a citizen or a corporation, pay you taxes as a government, and you defend me. It's the heart of the sort of pretty much the postmodern state. But in this space, governments can't. They can defend themselves. They all wear the offence side, we talked before, but they can't defend the corporate. It's 95% of the networks and much more of the value is sitting out in corporate networks. And to a degree, because of efficiency reasons, they all look a bit the same, which makes them so easy to attack. So part of the challenge we now have is a change in mindset in corporates, that we actually have to defend ourselves. Part of our cost is to defend ourselves. It's a bit like the Dutch East India Company. The Peter van der Koen, I think he was the second governor of Batavia. Remember, he wrote back once to, I remember it well, I spoke about him. Here's a great quote, he wrote back to the governor saying, Your Excellencies, your cannon buys your trade and your trade must buy cannon. Now, I'm not saying we should get that far, but in the 1600s, businesses had to defend themselves. And I sort of wonder in this space, but this is a different space, we now have to think much more about it's the corporate's role to defend their IP. Don't expect other people to do it for you.
Thanks, Paul.
Good.